What if the world's most advanced defensive line, a line celebrated as unbreakable, constructed with billions of dollars and guarded by the finest doctrines and technologies the West could muster, could collapse in a matter of just a few days? Not because of overwhelming firepower or a storm of tanks, but because shadowy, almost invisible forces slipped past every sensor, every watchful eye, and every confident prediction. Imagine a scenario where the investment of a decade, the pride of an alliance, and the very foundation of deterrence could be unraveled not by direct confrontation, but by a subtle, devastating assault. This is not a hypothetical from a military thriller, but the story of the Drake Line, a line that, for years, was regarded as the ultimate symbol of Western defensive might. The Drake Line was no ordinary wall. It was a sprawling labyrinth of reinforced concrete bunkers, staggered trenches, and minefields so dense that every single step could mean disaster for an attacker. Western engineers and NATO planners poured their expertise, their resources, and their reputations into its construction. It was a marvel of engineering, a fortress in the truest sense of the word, and for years it was considered utterly impenetrable by military experts worldwide. To grasp the scale of this undertaking, let's put it in perspective with history. In the 20th century, the Maginot Line in France was considered the gold standard of fortifications, an immense belt of bunkers and underground tunnels stretching hundreds of kilometers. Yet, even the Maginot Line, with all its might and its lessons, was not as technologically advanced as the Drake Line. The latter boasted not just physical barriers, but digital ones. Encrypted communications, satellite uplinks, and real-time data links connecting every outpost and every gunner. But then, in the spring of a year still fresh in the world's memory, Russian forces shattered the myth of the Drake Line in less than 4 days. They did not do so with a bludgeon, but with a scalpel, using electronic warfare, deep intelligence, and precision attacks in a campaign that upended every expectation. Suddenly, the world was forced to confront a chilling new reality. Even the most sophisticated high-tech barriers can crumble when faced with modern, invisible threats. How is it possible that a wall designed with the best Western strategies and the latest technology could fail so rapidly? Where did the defenders miscalculate? What unseen hands and subtle tactics brought this mighty line tumbling down? And what does this mean for the future of warfare and national security? If our faith in modern fortresses is misplaced, the risks are not just theoretical, they are catastrophic. Nations could lose not only money and precious lives, but also their credibility, their sense of security, and their standing on the world stage. The fall of the Drake Line is not just a military embarrassment. It is a wake-up call for every strategist who believes that technology alone is enough to keep us safe. Let us pull back the curtain and examine why this fortress, hailed as the pinnacle of Western military doctrine, proved so vulnerable when the real attack came. To do so, we must begin with the foundations, the very design of the Drake Line, and the assumptions that shaped its construction. Only by understanding its strengths and its weaknesses can we grasp how the unthinkable became reality. So, how do you build a wall that no army can break? NATO believed it had found the answer in the Drake Line, a name that carried both legend and a promise of invincibility. Named after a storied Canadian general, the Drake Line quickly became the ultimate symbol of Western determination. It was designed to stop the mightiest of assaults, a fortress stretching for dozens of kilometers across the Kharkiv front. Official briefings declared it impenetrable. The public, fed a steady diet of images and reports, saw only confidence and capability. Political leaders visited the line, posing for photos in front of its imposing bunkers, and newspapers ran headlines celebrating its completion as a milestone for peace and security. The engineering behind the Drake Line was truly breathtaking. Instead of a single line of defense, there were 3 main belts, layered across 40 kilometers of terrain. The first belt was a vast minefield, so densely packed that every square kilometer contained hundreds of hidden threats. These included both anti-tank and anti-personnel mines, with some using advanced sensors to detonate only for specific targets. In many ways, this recalled the dense minefields of World War II, but with the added lethality of 21st-century technology. Next came the heart of the defense, a network of hardened bunkers, concrete citadels, each connected by full-profile trenches and designed with overlapping fields of fire. Every approach to the main line of resistance was carefully calculated to maximize casualties among attackers while minimizing the risk to defenders. The fire plan was layered and multi-tiered. Every sector was covered by at least 3 or 4 firing positions, ensuring that any enemy movement would be met by a deadly crossfire. This principle, known as mutually supporting fire, has been a hallmark of strong defenses throughout history, from medieval castles to modern battlefields. Further back, the third belt provided depth and flexibility. Here, reserves waited, artillery batteries, rapid response units, and supplies, all ready to plug any gap or repel a breakthrough. This arrangement echoed the defense-in-depth strategies that have protected cities and nations for centuries, from the Roman limes to the Soviet defense of Moscow in World War II. But the Drake Line was more than just earth and steel. What set it apart was its digital backbone, a nervous system of encrypted radios, satellite uplinks, and instant data feeds. Centralized command nodes linked every sector, promising real-time awareness and seamless coordination. NATO officers boasted that nothing could surprise them. Every movement would be seen, every breach instantly countered. The system integrated drone launch pads, automated sensors, and even artificial intelligence algorithms to analyze surveillance data and predict enemy actions. The effort to build the Drake Line was colossal. NATO spent hundreds of millions of dollars and devoted months of relentless labor. Every detail was scrutinized, from the thickness of each bunker wall to the camouflage netting stretched over supply depots, from the placement of anti-drone electronic jammers to the orientation of each defensive firing port. The line was dotted with hidden observation posts, remote-controlled weapon stations, and underground shelters built to withstand direct hits from heavy artillery. On paper, the Drake Line was a fortress for the modern age. But here's the twist. The very complexity that made the line so formidable also hid its greatest vulnerabilities. In their drive to create an unbreakable defense, the planners may have overlooked the old adage that the higher the wall, the greater the fall. Billions of dollars, the credibility of Western military doctrine, and reputations at the highest levels all hung in the balance. If the Drake Line could be breached, not by brute force, but by exploiting unseen flaws, then perhaps the entire foundation of modern defense was at risk. This was not the first time such a challenge had arisen. In the Second World War, France's Maginot Line was outflanked by German blitzkrieg through the Ardennes, a region believed to be impossible. The lesson: no matter how strong a defense appears, it is only as good as its ability to adapt to new threats. Yet, while the world obsessed over high-tech wonders and concrete bastions, few asked the most dangerous question. What if the real weakness was something no engineer could reinforce? What if the fortress's greatest strength, its integration and interconnectedness, was also its Achilles heel? But as the first reports from the front arrived, a different story began to unfold, one that no simulation had predicted and no war game had truly accounted for. The real battle for the Drake Line was about to begin, and it would be fought not just with bullets and shells, but with signals, silence, and shadows. What if the heart of the world's most advanced fortress could be stopped cold with a single keystroke? This nightmare scenario became reality for the Drake Line, a symbol of NATO's technological prowess and a monument to the dangers of digital dependency. Similar to the devastating Stuxnet cyber attack that crippled Iranian nuclear facilities over a decade ago, this was a conflict fought in ones and zeros, not trenches and artillery. First, there was a classic error: over-reliance on fixed defenses. Rows of strong points, deep trenches, and hardened bunkers provided resilience, but also mapped out a predictable, rigid defense. These were ideal targets for a patient, calculating adversary, one willing to study, probe, and exploit patterns. History is full of examples where rigid defenses became liabilities, from the static lines of World War I to the fall of Singapore's fortress in World War II. Yet the true fatal flaw lay in the digital web binding everything together. Command, control, and intelligence all flowed through sophisticated networks, built to NATO's exacting standards, but still vulnerable to disruption. The system promised flawless coordination. In truth, it created a glaring single point of failure. Ironically, the very tools designed to prevent surprise, the sensors, the radios, the satellites, became the means by which surprise could be delivered. For months, Russian intelligence dissected the Drake Line. Satellites tracked every supply convoy. Drones hovered unseen above camouflaged bunkers. Human agents slipped through the cracks, gathering secrets. By the time the attack began, every stronghold and command center had been plotted with surgical precision. Every weak point, every resupply route, every shift schedule was mapped for exploitation. But when the blow landed, it was not with tanks or missiles. Instead, Russian electronic warfare units unleashed a storm of radio-electronic suppression. The air filled with invisible static. Command posts abruptly lost their satellite links. Drones and reconnaissance aircraft found their signals hopelessly jammed. It was as if the entire line had been plunged into a digital eclipse. Further along the front, tactical jammers struck with even greater ferocity. The defenders' prized drones, their main source of battlefield vision, either crashed or fled in panic mode. GPS vanished. Digital communications went dark, leaving an eerie silence across the line. It was as though an invisible hand had reached out and severed every lifeline, every connection. In less than an hour, platoons and companies became marooned. Radios emitted only static. Ruggedized tablets were reduced to useless glass. Commanders could not reach their superiors or even the next trench. NATO's vaunted network-centric doctrine collapsed into confusion and isolation. This was not just a tactical setback. It was total paralysis. The defenders were plunged into darkness, unable to coordinate, unable to fight as one. Panic and despair rippled through every isolated bunker and foxhole. The psychological impact was severe. Soldiers accustomed to real-time support and instant orders suddenly found themselves alone, forced to make decisions with incomplete information, echoing the chaos of ancient battlefields where the fog of war reigned supreme. With every node blinded and every message lost, the Drake Line's legendary reputation evaporated. The fortress was reduced to a patchwork of frightened, cut-off outposts, stripped of its brain before a single shot was fired. In war, as in chess, it is often not the loss of a piece, but the loss of coordination that spells defeat. The defenders could no longer act as a unified whole. In the chaos, Russian ground assaults began, exploiting every blind spot with ruthless efficiency. The defenders, still reeling from the electronic onslaught, now faced a new, relentless threat. This was not a mass charge, but a series of carefully orchestrated attacks, each designed to paralyze and disrupt rather than simply destroy. What happens when defenders brace for a brute force assault, only to be undone by surgical precision? The answer unfolded with terrifying speed. As the electronic paralysis took hold, Russian forces launched a campaign of chilling accuracy. Instead of unleashing waves of indiscriminate fire, their artillery and drones struck with purpose. Command bunkers, communication nodes, and air defense nests, each dismantled with almost clinical care. There was no thunderous barrage, just the quiet, targeted erasure of the line's vital organs, leaving voids in what had seemed an unbreakable wall. It was a modern echo of the decapitation strikes used in previous conflicts, but now executed with digital precision. With the defenders blinded and cut off, specialized breaching teams moved. They did not rush a single breach point, but slipped through multiple weak spots at once, guided by live intelligence streams, sometimes even fed by compromised enemy cameras. The defenders' own sensors and radios, once their lifelines, remained dead and silent. This tactic mirrored the maneuver warfare doctrine that so often outflanks static opponents. Confusion spread like wildfire. Soldiers and officers, unable to receive orders, watched their digital maps flicker into uselessness. Moments later, unfamiliar weapons, thermobaric rounds, loitering munitions, began to fall, not on obvious targets, but on overlooked positions never meant to bear the brunt. The psychological blow was profound. It was not just superior firepower, but superior thinking that was tearing through the line. Any hope of regrouping vanished as the attack grew more unpredictable. Defensive pockets, once designed to support one another, became isolated, each a lonely island under relentless, pinpoint assault. As one position crumbled, panic infected the next. The famed first line, engineered to hold for weeks or more, unraveled in just a few hours. Its collapse sent tremors through the rear defenses, unspooling deeper belts with shocking speed. This was not unlike the domino effect seen in past wars, where the fall of one bastion leads to the rapid collapse of an entire front. By nightfall, the Drake Line was reduced to wreckage. The reputation of Western defensive doctrine was shattered. If a billion-dollar system could be undone with such swiftness, what did that mean for the planners who built it, and for the soldiers who trusted their lives to it? This question haunted military thinkers everywhere, echoing the doubts raised after the fall of the Maginot Line and other unbreakable defenses throughout history. As dawn broke, stunned survivors stumbled through the ruins, their faith in high-tech defenses deeply shaken. Many recalled stories from past wars, the fall of Singapore, the overrunning of the Bar-Lev Line during the Yom Kippur War, where seemingly invincible strongholds collapsed under new, unexpected tactics. The world watched, wondering if any fortress could truly be safe in this new era of war. The true lesson here is not about walls or weapons. It is about who holds sway over the invisible battlefield. The Drake Line represented the height of Western military engineering. Yet it collapsed not because its concrete was weak or its arsenal insufficient, but because its defenders lost the war of information. No fortress, regardless of its depth, sophistication, or cost, can withstand an enemy that moves faster, thinks sharper, and disrupts its lines of sight. Today, digital reliance is a double-edged sword. Satellites, encrypted radios, and networked command centers offer immense power, but they also create dangerous points of failure. When adversaries unleash electronic and cyber warfare, they can sever these lifelines in moments, turning the strongest positions into isolated, blind, and paralyzed targets. This is not unlike the ancient strategies of cutting an enemy's supply lines. But now, the lifeblood is information, not food or ammunition. Victory is no longer claimed by brute strength alone. Flexibility, real-time coordination, and adaptive tactics now overshadow rigid doctrines and overwhelming firepower. The fate of the Drake Line is a stark warning. The side that can sense, move, and adapt in real time will always outmaneuver those anchored to static plans and steel walls. The lesson is clear: adapt or fall. For Western militaries and their leaders, this is an urgent alarm. Strategies forged in the last century are faltering against foes who dominate the electronic and informational domains. If armed forces cling to outdated doctrines, they risk repeating disastrous mistakes, squandering billions, losing credibility, and putting national security at peril. The ghosts of past military blunders, the Maginot Line, the Siegfried Line, the Bar-Lev Line, loom large, reminding us that dogma is no substitute for adaptability. But this warning is not only for generals and ministers. Citizens and policymakers alike must understand that true defense, in this century, is rooted in adaptability, investment in skilled people, and resilience. It is not a matter of buying more hardware or inflating budgets. The cost of ignoring these truths is measured not only in lost battles, but in lost futures. National security, economic power, and international influence are all at stake. So what practical steps can be taken? First, militaries must prioritize training for electronic and cyber warfare, making every soldier as comfortable with digital threats as with physical ones. Exercises should simulate disrupted communications and force units to operate independently. Second, resilience must be built into every system, not just redundancy, but the ability to switch to alternative networks, even fall back on analog methods if necessary. Third, intelligence gathering must be holistic, combining human sources with technological surveillance to avoid being blinded by a single point of failure. Finally, a culture of adaptability must be fostered, where innovation is prized and rigid thinking is challenged at every level. Other nations have begun to heed these lessons. Israel, after the surprise crossing of the Suez Canal by Egyptian forces in 1973, reformed its defensive doctrines to emphasize mobility and intelligence over static strongpoints. The United States military, learning from cyber attacks on its own infrastructure, now drills for scenarios where GPS and satellite communications are denied. These are not just theoretical exercises. They are essential for survival in the wars of tomorrow. As military doctrines around the world absorb the lessons of the Drake Line's fall, one question lingers. If walls and weapons alone cannot guarantee security, what must change for the defenders of tomorrow? The answer demands a new way of thinking, and a willingness to adapt before it is too late. Who wins in the age of invisible war, the builder of concrete walls, or the master of unseen signals? The Drake Line was supposed to be unbreakable. Concrete, steel, and the finest NATO doctrines formed its backbone, promising safety against any assault. Yet when the attack came, there was no thunder of artillery, only silence. Radios flickered out, screens faded to black, and orders dissolved into static. The guardians of the line, cut off from command, stood isolated in a fortress designed for another era. Electronic warfare had turned their greatest strengths into fatal vulnerabilities. This is the new shape of conflict. Battles are decided before the first shot is fired. The side that rules the invisible spectrum, seeing without being seen, jamming signals, severing command, can paralyze an entire army. It is no longer about who stacks the highest barriers, but who can make their opponent deaf, blind, and leaderless amid the digital fog. In fact, the next defeat may not even be noticed by the public until it is far too late. There may be no spectacular explosions, no dramatic footage, just a sudden, inexplicable quiet as entire units vanish from the map. The billions spent on static defenses and rigid doctrines are rendered obsolete overnight by adversaries wielding intelligence and electronic supremacy. Every general, every strategist, every citizen must consider, are we defending ourselves with real strength or with comforting illusions? The Drake Line was never just a line on a map. It was a warning. In the 21st century, wars are won by those who can adapt, innovate, and exploit the invisible seams of their opponent's defense. Remember this. In wars fought in silence and code, the greatest victories leave no scars, only silence. Those who adapt survive. The rest are left behind, trapped in their own empty fortresses, monuments to a past that could not learn from its own warnings. The final lesson is clear and urgent. Adaptability, resilience, and mastery of the digital realm will decide the fate of nations. The Drake Line has fallen, not because it was weak, but because it was outthought and outmaneuvered. Let us not repeat its fate.